Member for Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today again I am honored to rise on behalf of the great people of Elizabeth, those who put me here to represent their interests in this honorable place. Mr. Speaker, today we find ourselves in this honorable place to debate a resolution that frankly I do not agree with. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, the majority of Bahamians do not agree with. Mr. Speaker, this resolution seeks to approve the sale of 51% of the shares of BTC to Cable and Wireless for peanuts, Mr. Speaker. I want to be clear to my constituents in Elizabeth and to all Bahamians who might have been confused today about the unorthodox parliamentary procedure that we witnessed. There has been no vote yet, Mr. Speaker, on the transfer of shares of BTC. That vote will come, and we will see who has the intestinal fortitude to stand up against this. Mr. Speaker, if one can separate themselves, Mr. Speaker, from the political rhetoric and deal with this issue objectively, Mr. Speaker, clearly one would see that this deal stinks. It is a bad commercial deal. It is a transaction that is highly questionable, secretive, and tainted by clear conflicts of interest, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently had the opportunity to do a number of walkabouts in Elizabeth to hear the opinions of the people, to hear the opinions on this BTC sale. And they told me, they said, Ryan, when you go into that honorable house, please vote against this deal, because we don't support this deal. We cannot agree to the sale of a majority of shares of our crown jewel to a foreign company. Mr. Speaker, my constituents have deep concerns and frankly some confusion over this deal. Their concerns can be summed up as follows, Mr. Speaker. Their primary objection, Mr. Speaker, was the sale of 51%, a majority controlling interest of BTC to a foreign company, Cable and Wireless. And not just any foreign company, a foreign company that had a history of trouble throughout the Caribbean. Selling control, Mr. Speaker, is a significant concern of my constituents. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, their second concern was there's too little transparency and way too many conflicts of interest. Mr. Speaker, constituents in Elizabeth asked me, why the lack of disclosure? Why withhold the memorandum of understanding for 2 months after it was signed? Why does IRCA, the regulatory agency in charge, appear to be a Cable and Wireless affiliate? Mr. Speaker, these are all troubling concerns of my constituents to the point where they don't trust this deal. They think it was a setup from the very beginning. Mr. Speaker, you hear the government promising lower rates. The Cable and Wireless is silent. And although my constituents welcome lower rates, when I explain to them that the reality of the situation is that IRCA, with the stroke of a pen, can reduce their rates. When I explain BTC has requested in the past for the regulatory agency to lower rates, and they were rejected, my constituents ask, if IRCA could lower the rates, why does the government keep saying this deal is necessary for lower rates? See, my constituents in Elizabeth are very astute, Mr. Speaker. They know we don't have to sell to Cable and Wireless for lower rates. We just need to go to IRCA to approve it. Now, Mr. Speaker, the fourth concern that they have is Bahamians appear to be shut out of opportunities by this government. One of my constituents told me they believe the theme of this government, especially with respect to this sale, is that Bahamians need not apply. Residents in Elizabeth have tremendous amount of national pride, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that a model has not been proposed or encouraged to promote Bahamian ownership is very, very discouraging to them. Mr. Speaker, we must do better as a government. We must do better in recognizing the pride of Bahamians and the self-confidence and self-worth that they have. Now, Mr. Speaker, the fifth concern, and the one that I will deal with in length today, has to do with this fire sale price. 51% of the shares, Mr. Speaker, of BTC are being sold for far less than even what the assets are worth. And unlike a minister of the government, I don't mean the book value of the assets, I mean the fair market value of the assets of BTC. Mr. Speaker, my constituents wonder, with all of the upgrades that were done, with all of the profits that BTC makes, with all of the monies that this government has withdrawn from BTC in the last 2 years alone, how could they only accept a maximum of $156 million for 51% of the shares of BTC? So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to tell the good people of Elizabeth, I have heard them, I have listened to them, and I do not support this deal. Yes. Mr. Speaker, this is a bad commercial deal. Proclaiming that this is a sale, Mr. Speaker, of 51% of the shares of BTC for a purchase price of $210 million is an exercise of intentionally deceiving the Bahamian people on the commercial terms of this deal. First of all, I'd like to address the actual proceeds that we can expect from this deal. The government says they've agreed to sell 51% for $210 million. However, Mr. Speaker, when one looks more closely at the terms of the transaction, take a good look at the share purchase agreement, read the shareholders' agreement, it is clear that the Bahamas government is receiving far less than $210 million. And is equally clear that whatever the government eventually receives is far less than the true value of 51% of BTC. See, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas government is obligated to leave at least $15 million in the company, and maybe more. Mr. Speaker, this amount must be deducted from the total purchase price that we're going to receive. In fact, I just finished a deal as a private lawyer, similar stock purchase deal, where no money was left in the company. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, this government is obligated to fund the pension liabilities in the amount of $39 million. I want the Bahamian people to understand, this is your money. $39 million is your money. It might come out of the proceeds from the sale, but it might not. It does not matter. $39 million is the people's money. And you have to deduct this from the purchase price, Mr. Speaker. You have to deduct it from the purchase price. See, Mr. Speaker, taking into account these obligations of the Bahamas government, of the Bahamian people, the most the Bahamas government will receive is $156 million for the sale of 51% of the shares of BTC. Mr. Speaker, this is unconscionable. How can we sell 51% of our most valued government corporation for peanuts? In fact, Mr. Speaker, some have estimated the value of BTC to be $600 million or more. Yet this government has negotiated to sell a majority of BTC to Cable and Wireless for $156 million. See, Mr. Speaker, this makes no sense, and something here is clearly wrong. I object to this, Mr. Speaker, and I cry shame on all of them sitting over on that side for accepting what is clearly less than market value for BTC. But, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to take my word for it. Let's take the word of the most respected financial newspaper in the entire world. Mr. Speaker, the Financial Times pointed out that $210 million purchase price was below the industry average. What this means is other companies in the telecommunications sector, Mr. Speaker, demand a far larger amount if you were to buy them. See, Mr. Speaker, what the Financial Times is getting at is this sale of companies are usually valued at a multiple of what they earn. And for a telecommunications company, that multiple, Mr. Speaker, is between 6 and 8 times of what those earnings are. Mr. Speaker, in BTC's case, based on the numbers actually published by Cable and Wireless in their business plan, this would mean BTC has a value of between $620 million and $828 million, based on Cable and Wireless's numbers and the industry norm for what you value these companies at. Mr. Speaker, 51% of the shares would then be worth at least $310 million and as much as $414 million. And Mr. Speaker, if it is understood that $210 million is clearly below this market value, certainly, Mr. Speaker, $156 million is far below what 51% of BTC is worth. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, Cable and Wireless just recently sold their Bermuda operations. The reason they gave, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, they say it was a lack of growth and it does not fit into their business plan, the Bermuda operations. But, Mr. Speaker, what's of note about this transaction is that Cable and Wireless received more for their sale of Bermuda operations that had no growth, that didn't fit into the business plan, than what they're buying BTC for when you measure it on a per-subscriber basis. See, Cable and Wireless, Mr. Speaker, they know they're getting the sweetheart deal. The numbers demonstrate this. All you have to do is compare it to others. Cable and Wireless knows the sweetheart deal they're getting, and whoever negotiated this deal for the government, Mr. Speaker, they should be fired right away or submit their letter of resignation right now. See, Mr. Speaker? Were you on the negotiating team, Marco City? Did you sit on that team? Table your resignation, just like Bamboo Town did. Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker? It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that 51% of BTC is worth more than $156 million. Mr. Speaker, I can't compete with that. Mr. Speaker, 51% of the assets alone are worth more than $156 million. Let me explain what I mean, Mr. Speaker. I argue the cellular license that BTC currently owns is worth at least $100 million. In fact, both Cable and Wireless and the Bahamian government agree that it's worth $100 million. See, Cable and Wireless and the government agreed to the 3-year exclusive on cellular license. And if the government violates that arrangement, the government has to pay Cable and Wireless $100 million. Now, why they negotiated this penalty on themselves, I have no idea. But what is clear is that Cable and Wireless and the Bahamian government put a value of $100 million on that cellular license. So, Mr. Speaker, that would mean that under the government's voodoo economics that they have, 51% of all of the other assets of BTC is only worth $56 million. Mr. Speaker, this is unconscionable. Certainly the infrastructure of BTC, the 91 parcels of property owned by BTC, the 154 leased and licensed properties, and the network of fiber that interconnects the islands of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Haiti, and all of the other equipment and assets, Mr. Speaker, and most of all, Mr. Speaker, The value of the Bahamian workforce, the experience and expertise of the Bahamians working there is worth far more than $56 million, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, under the Progressive Liberal Party government, the Bahamas invested $353 million in a capital upgrade of BTC. Mr. Speaker, the PLP condemns this F&M government for attributing such low value on the goodwill and institutional benefits created on the backs of hardworking Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. Bahamian people deserve better, Mr. Speaker. This government has failed them again. They failed them at every opportunity, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, they deserve more compensation for their efforts than $156 million. Mr. Speaker, in 2008 and 2009, the Bahamian government withdrew $120 million in dividends that this F&M government presumably used to prop up its failures in the financial management of this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, will the same thing happen with the proceeds of this sale? See, no one has specified, Mr. Speaker, what the proceeds are going to be used for. We heard the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, at the F&M's poorly attended rally the other night, where he said he is selling 51% of BTC to Cable and Wireless, and I quote, "because I need the money! Mr. Speaker, it is clear the government of the Bahamas is selling 51% of BTC in an act of desperation, Mr. Speaker, selling it for much less than it's worth, Mr. Speaker, selling BTC at a fire sale price, Mr. Speaker, to compensate for the failure of this administration in the financial management of this country. See, Mr. Speaker, this F&M government is operating contrary to the interests and opinions of most Bahamians to provide for cover for its failures, giving away a national asset, Mr. Speaker, in a bad commercial deal to make up for their failures. Mr. Speaker, this isn't good governance, but evidence of failure by this government to act in the best interest of Bahamians. See, Mr. Speaker, the PLP has never been in favor of selling 51% of BTC in any privatization exercise. We have always advocated, Mr. Speaker, of selling 51% of BTC, 49% of BTC, and we still do, Mr. Speaker. In fact, even the Prime Minister, before he changed his mind, was against the sale of 51% of BTC. I will never, ever sell the majority of BTC shares to a foreign entity, says the Prime Minister, Hubert Alexander Ingram, in 1997. I will never, ever sell the majority of BTC shares to a foreign entity. The man of his word apparently is no longer a man of his word. I also heard a cabinet minister imply to Bahamians that there's no difference between 49% and 51%. See, Mr. Speaker, this was surprising to me. Somebody who has a degree in economics should know better, Mr. Speaker, as anyone can appreciate the benefits that come with majority ownership. In fact, Mr. Speaker, when a company acquires a majority interest in a company, they typically pay extra for these shares. It's called a control premium, Mr. Speaker. See, these are serious implications for selling 51% of BTC.
Did you go to the concert last night?
A majority shareholder, Mr. Speaker, in this case Cable and Wireless, generally has significant control over the company. The ability to make decisions that affect all Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. Putting this type of control, Mr. Speaker, in the hands of a foreign entity is not only against the philosophy of the PLP, Mr. Speaker, it's against empowering Bahamians. It has serious long-term implications, Mr. Speaker, for the advancement of Bahamians. Mr. Speaker, a majority shareholder can affect the hiring of management, can affect the transfer of services and responsibilities to other countries and companies. They have board control, Mr. Speaker, which sets the policies of the company. And they allow for the separation of employees from the company. All the majority owner can do. See, selling 51%, Mr. Speaker, of BTC to Cable and Wireless, a foreign company, proves that this F&M government supports no real initiatives of empowering young Bahamians, Mr. Speaker, or of champion entrepreneurship, Mr. Speaker. Entrepreneurship being a viable option for many Bahamians. The government's responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to sell 51% of BTC to Cable and Wireless implies that their model is to create a nation of workers only, as opposed to promoting careers and ownership and empowerment, Mr. Speaker. So the PLP asks, what exactly is the Bahamian public getting from this sale, besides the export of ownership of our crown jewel to a foreign entity? See, Elizabeth cannot support this philosophy, Mr. Speaker. Elizabeth cannot support the commercial terms of this transaction. This is not about political rhetoric, Mr. Speaker. It is about what's in the best interest of Bahamians, the best interest of my constituents in Elizabeth. And the sale of 51% of BTC to Cable and Wireless is not in their best interest, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, don't let this government fool you. They will claim they believe in Bahamians because they will make 25% of the shares available. Well, Bahamians deserve more than crumbs, Mr. Speaker. And even this statement, Mr. Speaker, is misleading the Bahamian public. I want Bahamians to know that the shareholders' agreement defines who's a Bahamian. Do you know that pursuant to this agreement, this government believes that Bahamians are companies with 40% foreign ownership? Did you know that? That isn't a Bahamian to me, Mr. Speaker, and it's not a Bahamian to the Progressive Liberal Party. See, Mr. Speaker, maybe to this government, what a Bahamian is a foreign company. They are the foreign national movement, Mr. Speaker. In my mind, Mr. Speaker, a Bahamian is a Bahamian, and I don't need no shareholders' agreement to tell me what that is. Mr. Speaker, after this deal and after the government offers its shares, it's entirely possible that foreign persons will own far more than 51% of this company. So be honest, Mr. Speaker. I tell my colleagues on that side, be honest to the Bahamian people. Stop ducking them. Stop avoiding the issues. Tell the Bahamian people the real economic terms of this deal. When Cable and Wireless will receive far more than 51% of the profits from this company. They get 2% of the gross revenues, Mr. Speaker, as a management fee. You add that to 51% of the profits, and they could be well over 60% of the profits from this company. The management fee is just another tool, Mr. Speaker, to skim money off the top of BTC for the benefit of foreign companies. See, Mr. Speaker, the PLP believes that BTC should not be part of a regional conglomerate, but should strive and compete to be the dominant regional telecommunications company. The PLP believes, Mr. Speaker, that BTC can dominate the region, owned and run by Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, our leader spoke of the Bank of the Bahamas model, and we believe and recommend this model for deepening the share ownership democracy for all Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. What I mean by this, Mr. Speaker, is that the Bahamian-owned BTC, pursuing a vision of being a dominant regional telecommunications company, will provide ownership and empowerment, Mr. Speaker, for all Bahamians. The PLP government set the framework for this with its increased capital investment into BTC. And BTC is prepared to take on this vision to be the AT&T of the Caribbean, Mr. Speaker. I want to take an opportunity just to further explain what I mean by this. Mr. Speaker, we must have confidence in our institutions and that Bahamians can own and operate and compete effectively in the region. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that share ownership and the empowerment structure of the Bank of the Bahamas is the model for ownership of BTC. See, the Bank of the Bahamas is 51% owned by the government and the National Insurance Board. The remaining 49%, Mr. Speaker, is owned by approximately 4,000 Bahamian shareholders. The Bank of the Bahamas competes successfully in a highly competitive international market, the financial services field. The Bank of the Bahamas is managed by Bahamians in an international marketplace, Mr. Speaker. An innovative and dynamic management, Mr. Speaker, so much so that they have expanded internationally to Miami. Likewise, no, the F&M didn't do that. The management of Bank of the Bahamas did that. Mr. Speaker, likewise, BTC should be 51% owned by the government of the Bahamas and 49% owned by Bahamians. BTC should be run by Bahamians in an equally and dynamic expansionist fashion, Mr. Speaker. The model is proven in a highly competitive industry. It is a model for Bahamian empowerment, a Bahamian share-owning democracy, Mr. Speaker. Like the expansionist nature of Bank of the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, which is run by Bahamians, the vision of the PLP for BTC is also an expansionist model run by Bahamians. BTC has tremendous opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and BTC currently has a direct link to South Florida. And because of the vision of Bahamian management and the PLP government, Mr. Speaker, they have expanded with direct connections to Haiti and Cuba. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, the logical question, where are the largest number of immigrants in South Florida from? Haiti and Cuba. So imagine a scenario where BTC controls most of the telecommunications traffic between South Florida, Haiti, South Florida, Cuba, and obtaining a piece of every single phone call that goes between those countries. Imagine the expansionistic philosophy and the platform that BTC can grow from that. The philosophy is that of Bahamian management. We don't need cable and wireless for this to happen, Mr. Speaker. It's a Bahamian position put forward by Bahamians for Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. See, this would be the foundation, Mr. Speaker, for further expansion throughout the Caribbean, interconnecting other countries such as the Dominican Republic and Jamaica. This is how BTC becomes the dominant regional telecommunications force that we dream of, operated by Bahamians. See, Mr. Speaker, we have to think big. We have to believe in our people, Mr. Speaker. We have to believe that they can dominate the region. We have to support programs, Mr. Speaker, and policies to make this happen. Yes. You don't just sit back and wait. You go and you set it up and you do it for Bahamians, Mr. Speaker. Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, this BTC deal, this stinks to high heaven. Oh, yeah. It stinks because this government is giving away 51%, a controlling interest to a foreign company. And not just any foreign company, a bad foreign company. From the start, Mr. Speaker, when Bahamians were told that they need not apply, this process has not been transparent. In fact, Mr. Speaker, even though the government has received the voluntary workforce reduction program when they signed this agreement, they haven't provided it to the Bahamians to see. They haven't disclosed it to the Bahamian public. Disclose to the Bahamian public how Bahamians will be fired. Let them know. You have the plan, table it, put it in the public domain. Half-stepping, Mr. Speaker, is not what's called transparency. Ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, why is this company being sold for less than the value of the assets? And not just a little bit less, but hundreds of millions of dollars less, Mr. Speaker. This deal stinks, and it doesn't pass the smell test, Mr. Speaker. See, a government for the people, Mr. Speaker, would promote a platform of privatization that provides ownership and share-owning democracy for all Bahamians. You don't sit back and accept whatever you get. You put in place a model to empower Bahamians, Mr. Speaker, putting forth the alternative, looking out for the people you represent. So my colleagues on the other side, you know what your constituents are saying. You know what your constituents are pleading for. They have the same cares and concerns as my constituents. Be bold. Have some courage. Represent your people. Be brave like the member from Bamboo Town who couldn't sit idly by under this tyrannical leadership on that side. Vote your conscience. Vote against this sale. Vote against the sale to a foreign company. Stand up to your Prime Minister. Show courage just this once. The people of the Bahamas will carefully watch this vote. They're going to be looking. They want to see which MP votes for what. Who has the guts to get it right, Mr. Speaker? See, this is not a debate about privatization, Mr. Speaker. This is a debate about selling 51% of BTC to a foreign company at a fire sale price, Mr. Speaker. So stand up and represent your people. Vote no to this deal. Elizabeth does not support this deal. Elizabeth does not support selling 51% to a foreign company for peanuts. Elizabeth proudly votes no.